So we're going to shift gears now, and we're going to pause on the awards and have a special guest join us for a little break in the action, and then we will return to the awards. And for this, I'm going to share my screen and ask that we bring in Dr. Michael Gottesman, who will be joining us. Michael, welcome.
Good morning, Eric. And let me start by saying how delighted I am to share the stage with so many outstanding scientists and administrators in NHGRI. And I could not agree with you more about the contributions of Colleen and Trish, and obviously Dan, and all the other people in your institute that have done an amazing job this year. So congratulations to all of them.
So we're calling this a fireside chat without fire, but I want to welcome you back to the Institute, and we'll get there because this was your home for a while, at least partial home. I want to just start out by saying that I don't know if you heard earlier that today it just happened by scheduling, not deliberately. Today's actually my birthday, and I will tell you candidly, Michael, this is the highlight of my birthday. I've been looking forward to this chat for a long time, and this is going to be my birthday present. Spend time talking with somebody who I regard as my colleague, as a mentor, actually as a hero in many ways, but also as a friend. I've known you for a number of years, and I know so much about you, and I really wanted to share that with the rest of the Institute. And I think our intramural program knows a lot about you to some extent, but I'm not sure other parts of the Institute, because it's been a long time since you were at the Institute briefly as our acting director. So I just thought it'd be fun and especially as we'll get to the fact that you're about to transition out of your position in the coming months. I just thought it'd be fun to sort of chat and learn more about you, and you have so many stories to tell. And we unfortunately have about 30, 35 minutes or something to tell them, but we're going to work our way through. So make sure you can see the screen because we are going to do some of this through images. So we're going to sort of do a little bit of Michael's journey through life to sort of set the stage. And we were sneaky. We got some pictures to help do this. So including some pictures here. So I understand that you were born in 1946 in New Jersey. And here's a picture of you probably at about, 9 months, something like that. And another picture maybe about age 6, maybe about age 8, something like that. So maybe tell me a little bit about your family. I actually don't know about if you have siblings, what your parents did. I knew you grew up in New Jersey, but just fill that in a little bit.
Yeah, so I actually was born in Jersey City at the Margaret Haig Memorial Hospital, which is a famous obstetrics hospital in New Jersey. And I keep running into people who were born in that hospital. Apparently, most people in northern New Jersey were born there. Lived in New Jersey for a couple of years, and then my family moved to Flushing, New York, which is part of Queens. And my parents were both hardworking folks who, suffered during the Depression. Neither of them were college grads. Both attempted to go to college, but ended up having to take time off to take care of their family. My father was not born in this country. He's a Russian Jew who moved here after his father was killed in a pogrom in what's now called it's part of Ukraine and Russia that they're fighting over. And so I'm a first generation, at least on one side of my family, and the first to go to college. I went to a public high school, Flushing High School, and I graduated there as valedictorian. And I was the first person from Flushing to get into Harvard, and went there as an undergraduate.
And at what age? I happen to learn what age.
Yes. So New York had various ways to accelerate people during their public education. And I skipped a grade in elementary school, and then was in a middle school, which had 3 years done in 2. So grade 7, 8, 9 were done in 2 years. And so I was actually just 15 when I graduated from high school and started college. I was the youngest person in my college class.
At Harvard.
And I know there's a tradition in the Genome Project of having acting directors who graduated quite early. Dr. Collins is one, and Dr. Watson was another, in fact. So I was keeping that tradition. It may have been a requirement at the time to be the director of Genome.
Oh, well, if it counts, I skipped kindergarten, so I went to school. I went to college a year early. It wasn't 15, but it was 17.
Yeah.
And siblings?
I have a brother, an older brother, who has been all of his life a school teacher, is retired now. He teaches history and English, or taught history and English. And he actually lived most of his life in Oregon, in Eugene, Oregon, and moved recently to New Jersey, I guess, to get back to his roots. And he's nearby. We actually just saw his family over Thanksgiving. Everyone vaccinated, everybody in good shape, tested.
And one sibling?
Yeah, just one, an older brother.
And were you a science nerd in high school?
I was a science nerd. So you have the picture of me in 55, 56 up there. 57, Sputnik was launched. And so there I was, an 11-year-old, really interested in space. I thought I'd be not an astronaut, but an astrophysicist or an astronomer. And I was always interested in science, I have to admit. So that's kind of part of my early life. And I think there are probably many people in my ilk who went through that period. The other thing that was very influential, and we should not forget, particularly in this time of people worrying about vaccination, is the Salk polio vaccine. So I was one of those people in the first grade who was being tested along with millions of other elementary school kids with the first Salk vaccine clinical trials. And I remember very distinctly lining up in school, getting ready for that jab, feeling quite anxious, but there was not a single parent who thought this was not a wonderful idea. Everybody was really terrified about polio, and having an opportunity to participate. That had a lasting effect on my desire to become a biomedical researcher.
And so were you pre-med beginning to end at Harvard?
So I was not officially pre-med. I mean, Harvard didn't have a pre-med.
Right, but was your eye on?
Yeah, so I thought I would be going to medical school. I was a biochemistry major, and took quite a lot of math and biochemistry, chemistry as an undergraduate, but also tried to have a pretty broad education, and benefited, I think, from the offerings at Harvard, and really enjoyed my time there as an undergraduate.
Now, my understanding,
in all fields.
Yeah, my understanding is in addition to biochemistry, the other thing that happened at Harvard is reflected in this picture, right?
That's right.
You were quite the catch back then. So
I don't know if I was quite the catch. I think Susan, who I met when I was a sophomore, had no idea that I was just 16 years old. But we met, and interesting story about our meeting, because I asked her out to go to the theater, and that date was November 23rd, 1963, which was the day that Kennedy was assassinated.
Oh, wow.
The theater was closed, and we spent the evening walking around in downtown Boston, feeling a real affinity for each other about our reactions to that very historically significant event. And I think the sparks of what was going to be a 55-year, well, almost 60-year romance started that evening.
And you got married by the end of college.
Yeah, so we got married. If you ask Susan, she'll say it was so she could move out of the dorm. Harvard had a requirement that you live in the dorm if you were an undergraduate, unless you were married. So we were married during my senior year.
So you were what, 19 years old when you got married?
Yes, I was.
Wow.
It's true. Fortunately, I did not make a mistake. It's easy to make mistakes at age 19.
So off you went to medical school by staying at Harvard, right?
Right. I went to medical school. There were two MD PhD programs at the time.
Yep.
One at Duke and one at Einstein. I applied to both, but it was very clear that Susan would have to move. She was a year away from graduating. And since I got into Harvard Medical School, and at the time, having an MD was as good a pathway into research, which I was interested in, as having an MD PhD. The MD PhD programs were just in their infancy. So I decided that getting an MD at Harvard would be adequate.
And does that partially explain your affinity to research because clinical medicine seemed complicated to you as evidenced by this complexity of whether you had a black cat or a black bag in your hand?
Oh my goodness. Yes. So we had a cat. The cat's name was Rin Tin Tin, as you might imagine. Not necessarily because we wanted a dog, but because that was the cat's name. And the cat was, of course, my first victim or patient, so to speak. Yes.
Is that as a medical student, that picture, or as a resident?
As a medical student. And I in fact, really enjoyed medicine. I still do.
Right. But something caught your eye at NIH and dislodged you from the Harvard pipeline and brought you here. Well, how did you hear of NIH and why did you come here?
So some of you may recall that there was a war waging during that period of my life, the war in Vietnam.
Yep.
And the year that I graduated from medical school, 1970, every single medical student in the country was drafted. So it wasn't, there was a general draft, but not everybody in the country was drafted. There was a lottery and you had a low number and you were in trouble. But every medical student was drafted because they needed physicians. And many of them were sent to Vietnam to act as physicians and surgeons for the soldiers who were being injured there. And so I had a choice to join the Army or to do my service in the public health service. And the public health service then was the Indian Health Service, the CDC, and the National Institutes of Health. And since I was interested in research and already had many contacts and colleagues and friends at the NIH, I decided, obviously, to apply to the NIH, and I was accepted. That cohort of people is known as the Yellow Berets.
Harold Harmis was another one of those Yellow Berets, right?
Harold was another one of the Yellow Berets, right. As was Dr. Fauci. Tony Fauci was also a Yellow Beret. And there are many of us still around.
I know you first started working with Marty Gelbert. Gellert.
Marty Gellert. Yep.
Gellert, and,
Yep. So I was a postdoctoral fellow with Marty Gellert.
Yep.
Marty was I shouldn't say was, he still is a fabulous scientist. I just saw his BSc review and, he's not as young as he used to be, but he still gets really outstanding reviews. He does fantastic science. And it was a really pleasure to work with him. And shortly after I arrived, he said that he was thinking about taking a sabbatical in Europe. And that he hoped that I would be able to stay in the lab and help keep our research running. And so very shortly after I started my postdoc, I had a year of fair independence.
Yeah.
And that experience, I think, has reinforced my belief that early independence is a very important way in which to encourage careers in research. It forces people to think about what problems are important, to learn how to network, to find other people who can help. And I had many senior mentors. I was then in what's now NIDDK, NIAMS at the time.
And then, I know, and these are just various other pictures we got from back when. I know you went back to Harvard briefly, but then came back here and stayed, right? You went on the Harvard faculty for briefly. Correct? Yeah.
So the reason I went back was because I came to NIH after my internship, my medical internship, now called the first year of residency.
Right.
I decided I'd like to go back and be boarded in medicine, so I needed more training. Eugene Brownwald at that point was the chief of medicine, replacing George Thorne at the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital. And so he was happy to have me back. And I skipped my junior residency. So it's another year that I skipped in my training. Became a senior resident and then passed my boards in medicine. And then was recruited back. The previous picture showed Ira Paston, his group. Both Susan and I were recruited back to the NIH.
That's that picture.
As senior investigators. So talk about skipping. So I skipped a year of residency. I skipped my tenure track and I became a senior investigator.
Wow. And of course, from there, you just rose in the ranks. I understand you were then chief of the molecular genetics section within NCI. Later, by 1990, you were the chief of NCI's laboratory of cell biology, and you were humming along. You were a productive researcher. You were climbing the ranks of NCI, and then something very interesting happened in the early 1990s, which will bring us full circle to this institute, when you were called on to be the acting director of what was then NCHGR, the National Center for Human Genome Research, which of course now has been renamed NHGRI, because of the departure, somewhat suddenly, of Jim Watson as our first director. And there's a picture of you at some ceremony, and then I think that was the whole institute. I think that's the photograph of the entire institute at the time, because remember, there was no intramural program, right. So it was just the extramural program overseeing the NIH's contribution to the Human Genome Project. So there must be, did you just not run away quick enough when somebody said come to the NHGRI on an active basis, or were you involved? Were you interacting with Jim when he was our first director? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm saving some of it from my memoir, so I won't tell you everything, but I'll tell you enough to make it sound interesting. So Bernadine Healy called me into her office. She was then director of the NIH, and she said, Jim Watson is stepping down as director. Actually, he didn't step down, he was pushed. Yes. And the details of that are really quite interesting, but I won't go into them. Okay. And she'd like me to become the acting director, just sort of out of the blue. I was a lab chief in NCI. I have to say that she and I were classmates in medical school. She had taken a year off to do research during medical school, and we graduated in the same class. So she knew me, and I guess was given a list of people who might be suitable for this job. And I said, well, I need to think about it. I'd like to talk to Jim and find out more about what was going on. And she said, no. You cannot leave this office until you make a decision. So, and those of you who know Dr. Healy can appreciate this story. And so I said, I guess, yeah, sure. It sounded like an interesting opportunity. And she promised me that there would be a very vigorous search starting immediately to find a new director, that it would not be a permanent position, because I was really not ready to take on full-time administrative responsibility.
And there was this crazy thing going on called the Human Genome Project, which, while you were knowledgeable about, it wasn't your main area focus. But you also had great colleagues that you were able to work with, such as Mark Geyer, who later became our extramural director, and then our deputy
and
director.
Elka Jordan, yeah.
And Elka Jordan, who was our deputy director and also head of our extramural program. And I'm not sure I totally understand the picture on the right, but this must relate something to that you knew Francis was coming or something, because it's interesting that there's a skeleton and the label of Francis across it.
I think it was a Halloween party. And Francis had already been recruited, obviously, but nobody knew that much about him. And so I guess there was just a skeleton of information. So he was represented by the skeleton. I don't remember the details of that particular picture. But I do remember, as you said, that Mark and Elka were fabulous colleagues. They knew how to run the institute. And in fact, Watson himself had been a sort of absentee director. He spent most of his time at Cold Spring Harbor. He would appear occasionally. And my job, to a great extent, was to try to restore morale to the wonderful group of people who had started that organization. And I met with a bunch of people. I started to meet with some of the center directors on the outside. And we focused on a couple of things. One was technology development at that point. And I remember distinctly a discussion about some new technology that involved trying to measure bases using DNA that was being injected by T. even phage into bacteria, because the phage would inject the DNA and you could measure differences in resistance across the membrane of the bacterium every time a different base went in. And this, of course, was the basis of nanopore technology, next-gen sequencing, which took many years to develop. But we started by supporting that work. And we also decided we needed to sequence the yeast genome, that we had a lot of data. We needed to finish that as a demonstration that having the full sequence of an organism's genome would be fabulously useful. And of course, it's turned out to be just that.
Were you at all involved in recruiting Francis?
Yes. And I was trying to remember, I don't have any particular records, whether I was the chair of the search committee or just whether there was a search committee. There was a committee, and I was very much involved in talking to Francis about this. And I actually remember saying to him, Francis, don't you want to be there when the human genome is sequenced and be the responsible party? And this was interesting because in general, Bernardine Healy and Jim Watson did not agree on anything, but they did agree that Francis would be a terrific director of the Institute. And there was a little bit of convincing, but I think this is something he really did want to do. And when he came, it was an enormous relief for me because suddenly the Institute had somebody in charge who actually knew a lot about genomics, was one of the inventors of the field, positional cloning and so on. So it was great to have Francis there. And then he asked me to stay on as the acting scientific director. So I've occupied many positions in genome. We recruited Jeff Trent, and Eric, I remember recruiting you from.
We're going to get there. We're going to get there in a second. Yeah. I was actually going to say the first time I got to know you, other than just knowing your name as a scientist, was you had to deal with some problems when you were acting NHGR or NCHGR director, and one of the problems was a little skirmish that was going on at Washington University that involved me as a first-year tenure track investigator and some problems with that grant that I will say for my memoirs, but is also not the nicest set of circumstances. And you had to mediate that in some way, or had to oversee a site visit that came in and mediate. That's how I first got to know you. And it's probably the first, I'm sure it's the first you got to know of me, not realizing that then when Francis accepted the job and then he tried to recruit me here, by that time, I actually think by the time that recruitment got serious, you were already the acting deputy director of Intramural Research, and then later became appointed the NIH Deputy Director for Intramural Research. So I remember when the first time we met was in your office in Building 1, on a recruitment trip here, when Francis was trying to convince me to come here. And I vividly remember meeting you and being inoculated with your enthusiasm for the Intramural Research program. But at that point, you had a new role. At that point, you were the Deputy Director for Intramural Research. And that was 28-ish years ago. I wanted to make sure everybody realized, I mean, you sort of already implied a couple things. How many things have changed since then? You were responsible for creating the post-baccalaureate training program and the graduate partnerships program. You implemented loan repayment programs. You institutionalized an intramural tenure track, as well as new career tracks for clinical investigators. You spearheaded multiple other programs related to diversity and equity, research integrity and leadership, and you developed a substantial organization and a number of responsibilities associated with your Office of Intramural Research. And so I remember arriving on the scene as a tenure track investigator and immediately being aware of you and your office, and you were a key to convincing me to come here. And I actually also remember, this is even before I became scientific director, and I don't know if you're going to remember this as well, but it shows you the kind of things you have to do as the Deputy Director for Intramural Research. Some of the things are to give out awards. Here's some award you're giving to Jeff Trent, or involved in something related to Jeff Trent. And I'll just leave this slide up for a bit. Where I'm sure as a DDIR, as it's called, the Deputy Director for Intramural Research, you got to cut ribbons and be interviewed and get asked lots of important things. But I remember, even when I was a tenure track investigator, I may have been a branch chief by then, but I certainly wasn't. The very first time I was you called me to serve on a committee was because there was an incident in the Intramural Research program where somebody put radioisotope in water. And drinking water in a cooler, and that must have kept you up at night and dealt with a lot of problems you had to deal with. And one of the things is you wanted to reduce the amount of radioactivity being used on campus, you put a committee together to look at alternate technologies. And you wanted a genomics geek, and you brought me in, and I remember serving on that committee for you, dealt with a bunch of recommendations. Do you remember that? I bet you do.
Do
That was a horrible incident you had to deal with.
There were congressional hearings. There were interviews on national TV. It was a major event, and it involved two postdoctoral fellows at the NIH, and the wife was pregnant, and the husband discovered that there was radioactivity in her urine. You know why he was tested for radioactivity, and he accused the supervisor of doing it because he wanted in some way to prevent this pregnancy from taking place. It was a very bizarre story. And the details, we still don't know for sure. The FBI got involved. Congress was involved. I was interviewed for national TV, and I remember sitting under these hot lights for a couple of hours, and they were trying to get me to look guilty or to admit that NIH had deliberately poisoned this poor fellow. And they didn't use even a second of it, which I was told was evidence that I didn't look guilty. So they didn't see any point in using it. It was just an amazing period, but not the only such episode. Being DDIR puts you kind of in the spotlight. Unfortunately, for things that sometimes go wrong. Right. I do want to emphasize something else you said, Eric, that I have been involved in lots of mediations and shuttle diplomacy. I was there when Francis and Craig Venter had some of their discussions. And one of the things that I do is I try to be able to convene the right people to get in the room to solve problems. It's a major, I think it's probably the major power that I have to bring people together.
Michael, you just set me up for the next thing I was going to ask about, because then fast forward, I then became scientific director and joined your table of SDs, where I worked with you quite closely, and it was wonderful. But I remember one of the first committees as an SD you asked me to serve on. It's exactly what you said. You have to convene people to deal with crises. And that was a crisis related to parking. Remember the parking task force that you and the NIH Ombudsman co-chaired and I had to serve on. That was yet another example of where you brought together a group to deal with hard issues, maybe even harder than radioactivity and drinking water is parking on the campus. And again, boy, that got tense at times, but we
do you remember the bus? We had a bus.
We went on a tour. We went on a tour to see all the parking options, and eventually we converted the lawn behind the Stonehouse into a temporary parking lot. But again, I learned from you how you mediate and moderate. Oh, God, it was remarkable. As an SD, I was thrilled to work with you and I vividly remember in 2004 when I was the co-chair of the research festival. That we wanted to bring you in to give sort of an overview of the Intramural Research program. That was back in 2004. And at that time, we surprised you with an award on behalf of the NIH scientific directors. So this was 2004. I just want to read what I wrote back then. I embarrassed you then, as you could tell these awards are, I like embarrassing people. But I embarrassed you then because here's just a small part of my speech I made in front of hundreds of people in Massar Auditorium. Needless to say, the collective responsibility of overseeing the multi-billion-dollar research enterprise of the NIH Intramural program is enormous and requires strong and decisive leadership on Michael's part, day in and day out. You can especially imagine the challenge associated with getting those 20-plus scientific directors in a room and getting them to work together in a productive way to tackle the hard issues that we seem to constantly face. There are several characteristics that make Michael a remarkably effective and well-respected leader, especially in the eyes of the scientific directors that he works closely with. First, he's a true NIH patriot. I simply know of no one more effective at articulating all the reasons why the NIH is a truly fabulous place to do research. Second, Michael is extremely good at making tough decisions and navigating delicate and complex situations, something he does on a daily basis. He has a remarkable style that brings fairness and compassion with each move he makes, engendering support because of his good judgment and his credibility. Finally, Michael is incredibly well-liked by his colleagues. Michael is simply amazing in his job. He guides all of us through the various obstacles and hurdles thrown our way, all the time remaining calm, all the time ensuring the most important issues are being addressed, and all the time keeping his most wonderful, sharp sense of humor. Michael, I wrote that in 2004, and now 17 years later, I don't think I would change a word because it's continued on for 17 years. And what's interesting is I remember you gave this incredibly interesting overview at the research symposium in 2004. And then when our intramural program celebrated its 25th year, we brought you back, and there 14 years later, you gave yet another overview of the intramural research program. And it was absolutely wonderful that you were able to really share with that and also talked about some of your connections. So one of the things I also did want to ask you about is, especially with this picture of Francis, is your service as deputy director was under 3 NIH directors, Harold, and of course then Elias Zerhouni, and then Francis. You know, their styles were so different. Their personalities were different. They were all incredibly wonderful leaders. What was it like to have to adapt to a change in that position as you had to continue to be the steward of the intramural program?
Yeah, no, I should add that actually there were 2 acting directors as well, Ruth Kirsten.
Yes, oh, that's true.
And Raynard Kington, and both of them had substantial terms. So there were really 5 people to whom I had to adapt. Each director's had a distinct personality, and we've been incredibly fortunate to the NIH over the last years to have so many really outstanding directors. If you look at the history of NIH, it's a bit spotty with respect to directors. Some of them, were chosen for political reasons and really didn't have the credentials to run an intramural or an extramural program. But the ones that I've served have been fantastic. Very clear visions about what they want to accomplish, very mission oriented, very supportive of the intramural program. Each distinct personalities and different styles, but all of them really wonderful to work for. So, I don't know about our incoming director. I suspect that person will be in the same mold. But having adapted to 5 directors, I think it is time to let somebody else take over this job for sure.
And so that leads me to what I was going to discuss next, and I mentioned it earlier, is part of the reason I invited you here today to have this conversation is this is part of not your farewell tour to NIH, but your farewell tour as the Deputy Director for Intramural Research. After 28 years, you are stepping down as soon as a replacement can be found. People may not realize I'm actually co-chairing the search committee along with Gary Gibbons to find your successor. We're looking wide and far for someone with really big feet because they have some pretty big shoes to fill. But it also gives you a chance. And you heard earlier, you're I don't know if you're taking a play out of Dan Castor's playbook or he's taking one from yours. But like Dan, as a physician scientist, you're returning to the lab full time. And it was your decision now to do it in part because you saw the end of Francis's tenure. You thought the next NIH director should have a new deputy, or were there other reasons now was the time you decided to step down?
Well, so there are a lot of things happening at NIH. And one of the things that I've been trying to encourage is, in general, sort of change in leadership. At every level of the NIH, there are leaders who've been in place for a very long time. And in fact, that reflects the quality of their work and their leadership abilities. But it's time. There's a new generation of really outstanding scientists, much more diverse group of scientists coming along. So we need to make opportunities for people to exercise their specific visions and to take over, an institution which is going to be timeless, but its end will be in sight if we don't turn over leadership. So I think this is really an important. I'm setting an example. I actually think that Dan was my inspiration. He gave such a wonderful talk to the board of scientific directors about why he was stepping down, and I thought, he's convinced me this is a good thing to do. So I am stepping down, and very happily, and I look forward to working in concert with whomever comes in to make sure they understand, what the requirements of the position are, and hopefully follow in my footsteps in terms of honoring and listening to all the scientists and all the people who work so hard at NIH. who have quite a lot to offer and need to be part of the leadership process.
And Michael, as you reflect back on your 28 years in this role, give me just, just very, don't have to go into any details, what's the thing you're the most proud of? And what's the one thing you wish you could have solved and still haven't solved, which will be a big challenge for the next one?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what I'm most proud of is working with the scientific staff. You've alluded to this on several occasions, but working with our scientific staff to solve problems that might interfere with their ability to do the very best science they can do. Providing an environment which is the unique intramural environment where people get, they're chosen based on their skills and their talents, their creativity, their innovation. And we need to provide an atmosphere in which they can continue to do the very best science. And there are almost, hundreds of examples of kinds of research being done in the intramural program that simply could not be done anyplace else. That's changed the face of biomedical research. My job has been to work with them. Everybody has issues that need to be resolved. And I see myself as a facilitator of research at the NIH. I also, we are a major training institution for all of biomedical research. Probably 10 to 15% of the postdoctoral fellows that are NIH supported are trained at the NIH. And now we have these, enormous summer program. The postbac program is huge, has grown, tremendously since we introduced it. All of these are opportunities to intervene in a positive way in people's career trajectories to make sure that they get what they need to be successful. And any one of them can be the savior of humanity and or somebody who has an idea which changes the way we think about the natural world. So I really enjoy working with the.
Well, what's the thing that's not solved? What's the thing that's going to be the big challenge for the next year?
I think the big challenge is what we talk about in terms of the culture of science. Scientists are inherently, even though they're creative and innovative, they're sort of inherently conservative about social structures. They don't like to change organizations. They don't like to change leadership. They like things being the same because it provides them with the security of knowing that, 5 years from now, nothing will be different. They can continue doing what they're doing. And I think that is a mistake. I think we need to really embrace some of the changes that are going on now in society at large and at the NIH. We need to embrace communities of people who've been shut out of science for many years, or at least not highly represented. And I think all of that requires everybody at NIH, putting this number one on their lists of priorities, to recruit, to sustain the careers, to help people become successful scientists. And I think that's the hardest thing. We've done surveys of our scientific staff and said, what are your top priorities? And of course, number one is always excellence in science, but diversifying and working for inclusive excellence is not necessarily among the top few things on their list. And we need to change that. That has to be really, really high up on everyone's list. So I think that's the one challenge I'll continue to have. I'm not going to stop working on that when I leave this position, but also the new leadership at NIH will be working on that.
So we're winding down, Michael, but I also wanted to make sure people realize that not only have you been an incredibly effective Deputy Director for Intramural Research, all the time you've had a very full and productive research career. You're a world leader in understanding how cancer cells elude chemotherapy. You have research groups that continue to be incredibly productive. Some pictures are shown here. You've received many honors. American Academy of Arts and Sciences member, American Association of Physicians, National Academy of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, many government honors, including the HHS Secretary's Award for Distinguished Service back in 2005. And so I just want to make sure people realize what an incredibly well-rounded individual you are. In addition to great leadership and management skills, you're also a great scientist. And here's a photo from when you got in the National Academy of Sciences. I want to make sure to share. But your other contributions also is that you're a family man. I know this is your daughter, right?
Right.
And your daughter is also a physician scientist?
She is. She just left a position as professor of cerebrovascular neurology at Hopkins to become the head of the stroke branch at the NIH.
So the next generation of NIH excellence is also a Gottesman, although maybe she changed her name. I actually don't know. But,
she does for social purposes, for professional purposes. She's a Gottesman. Yes.
And that's not your only child, correct?
No, I have a son who's a physicist, theoretical physicist.
And where is he?
So he was a faculty member at the Perimeter Institute in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. And he actually just moved to become a Brin professor of computational science at the University of Maryland. So my entire family is now in this area. Another reason, somebody once said to me in Washington, never say that you're stepping down from your position to spend more time with your family, because you will usually be indicted within a few weeks after you say that. But it really is true in this case. It is one of the reasons I have 3 grandkids in the area. And
you mean children that look like this?
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
So you're a family man, you're a parent, you're a grandparent, and this is another reason why I think you want to spend some more time with these little critters as well, and that's totally understandable. Well, lastly, what I would say is for those who have been watching, who have enjoyed hearing about this, Michael was kind enough to back a number of years ago, several years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago, to sit down with our historian, Chris Donahue, and not just do one sit-down oral history, but actually do 2 of them. And this is available on GenomeTV. And I would encourage you, although I still don't think he fully tells the Jim Watson stories, but we'll wait and read that in his memoir. But there is more of Michael on GenomeTV. And so with that, we've got lots of awards to give out, Michael. So we're going to thank you, and we're going to thank you in a nerdy way. I had to find a scientific genomic way to thank you. So I found a codon-based way of, which seems very appropriate on the NIH campus, to say thanks. I would say thanks, first of all, for being my friend and colleague. Thanks for being NHGRI's friend and colleague and former leader. Thanks for being a great deputy director at NIH. Thanks for being a great scientist and a role model, and someone of the highest integrity. And I just wish you, I know you're not going anywhere because you're going to still be on campus, we'll still see each other, but I just think you have a well-deserved transition coming up to do what you want to do, whether that be more time in the lab, more time hanging out with Dan Kastner and talking about great things, or more time spending with your children and your grandchildren. And the other thing I know is that if anybody from NHGRI ever emails you and wants your advice, I know you're going to make time for them, because that's just the kind of person that you are.
And it will be my pleasure. And just let me end up by thanking again everybody at Genome. You've done a marvelous job, an incredible job, and there's many good years ahead of you, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Thank you all, and thank you, Eric, for doing this. It's been great. It's been great fun.
I told you you'd have fun doing this. It wasn't going to be hard questions. It was going to be reminiscing. So thank you very much for making my birthday special, Michael. I really appreciate it.
Happy birthday to you.
Thank you. Thank you. See you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
I will stop sharing my screen, and I believe we are going to now turn the proceedings back over to Ellen Rothfuss, who's going to guide us through the issuance of many, many additional awards.